Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 416. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to talk about on today's show, including John Bolton's recent trip to Taiwan. So just want to remind people to share the show if you can. You find it at the Libertarian Institute, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. And you can also find the show on the blog at antiwar.com. Right now at antiwar.com, we are holding a fundraiser. So if you can head on over and help us out, I would really appreciate it. I'm the opinion editor at antiwar.com. I put together the viewpoints and the spotlight article every day. Also do a little bit of writing for the site. And so, a lot of antiwars.com's resources, help Dave DeCamp continue to just be the prolific writer he is. He is so crucial to, I think, the entire anti-war movement, because what Dave does is he finds stories that are very important about American foreign policy, but they're only in outlets where there's so much mainstream media spin in those articles that anybody who reads it has to, debunk several layers of propaganda to get to the truth. But Dave cuts through all of the junk, all the bias, all the propaganda, and writes just a hardcore factual information about what's going on. And so, help Dave continue to do that, and help us all continue to put out great content at antiwar.com. And now let's get into today's show, where, of course, we have quite a few articles from Dave DeCamp to talk about, including this one. Biden says journalism is not a crime as he seats Assange's extradition. Over the weekend, President Biden declared journalism is not a crime at the White House's Correspondents' Dinner, as a statement that rings hollow as the Justice Department is seeking the extradition of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange for exposing American war crimes. Biden opened his speech by discussing Evan Gershkovich, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal who recently was arrested in Russia. Evan went to Russia to shed light on the darkness that you escaped from years ago, Biden said, addressing his parents. Biden also mentioned Austin Tice, an American who disappeared in Syria in 2012 while working as a freelance journalist. The U.S. accuses the Syrian government of holding him, an allegation Damascus denies. Tonight, our message is this: journalism is not a crime. The president did not mention Assange or Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian-American journalist for Al Jazeera who was killed by Israeli forces in May 2022. She was gunned down by Israeli forces while covering an Israeli raid on the West Bank and wearing a blue vest marked "Pressed" written on it. Biden's speech came after a group of progressive Democrats led by Representative Tlaib, a Democrat from Michigan, sent a letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland urging the Justice Department to drop the charges against Assange, who faces up to 175 years in prison if convicted. We write to you today to call on you to uphold the First Amendment protections for the freedom of the press by dropping criminal charges against Australian publisher Julian Assange and withdrawing the American extradition request currently pending with the British government, Tlaib and the other lawmakers said in their letter. Assange is being charged for pushing documents leaked to him by former Army Private Chelsea Manning on the Iraq and Afghan wars. The WikiLeaks founder obtained the documents using standard journalistic practices, and his conviction under the Espionage Act was set a very dangerous precedent. The indictment against Assange was unsealed by the Trump administration in April 2019. At the time, Assange was dragged out of the Ecuadorian embassy in London and taken to Belmarsh prison, where he is still being held today. While in Belmarsh, Assange has been the subject of psychological torture, a UN rapporteur has determined. So, of course, Assange is a huge issue, and we talk about him a lot on the show. Of course, for the past, several years now, he's been held in Belmarsh prison 4 years. Our friend Misty Winston just held an event at the Department of Justice to, remember Assange has been there for that amount of time. And so we need to keep calling attention to it, because you have all these elite journalists who gather in Washington, D.C. and they do point out, like, Austin Tice shouldn't be wherever he is. He's a journalist. He should be alive and reporting, not either dead or in a Syrian prison, or potentially held by some Islamic forces somewhere, and Evan shouldn't be in a Russian jail. However, the U.S. needs to look at Shireen Abu Akleh and Julian Assange and realize that, we can't demand other countries have higher standards of freedom of the press than we do. It's just, stupid to do that. We need to uphold our own freedom of the press, and that means dropping the charges against Assange. All right, now let's move into some stories about the war in Ukraine. Ukraine says waiting for better weather for spring counteroffensive. And so there's been talks for months now that the counteroffensive was coming. A lot of people, I think, thought it would be underway by now, and they say it's now been delayed for weather. So an Ukrainian ambassador to the UK said heavy tanks that Ukraine received from Western backers cannot move in the mud. Obviously, the weather is not allowing so far the heavy tanks to move in the Ukrainian usual spring mud. He added that Kiev does not want to let Russia know when the counteroffensive will be launched, so the weather is playing a key part. We're not, telling them the exact day and exact direction, he said. And this is something that Daniel Davis brought up in a recent interview with Scott Horton that I think was important, and that is last year when Ukraine had a successful counteroffensive, a part of that was sleight of hand tactics where they were able to, I guess, deceive Russia to some extent as to where that counteroffensive was going to come, which meant that where it actually was launched didn't have as many reinforcements. And so all this rhetoric around when the counteroffensive is going to happen, I wouldn't be surprised that the Americans and their Ukrainian partners are going to roll out somewhat of the same strategy as they did last year. And whatever they're doing with the counteroffensive, everything that's said publicly is meant to be a misdirection. And so it could be that they're ready to go for their counteroffensive and it's going to start today, and that's why they're making this statement. It could also be that they don't have the ability to wage a counteroffensive, and they're just playing up the idea that this counteroffensive is coming to ensure that Russia is working on setting defensive positions rather than launching their own counteroffensive. So the counteroffensive is expected to target the land bridge to Crimea in the southern Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast, but there are increasing doubts among Kiev's Western backers that the Ukrainian offensive will be successful. And then, I just want to note on top of this that I read some reports that a former Ukrainian official said that he thinks the counteroffensive is going to target the Kerch Bridge. And I wonder, and I read this as a report, I think a Ukrainian military, maybe their equivalent to the Joint Chiefs, made a statement saying that, the Ukraine is going to look at carrying out attacks inside of Russia. And so I do wonder if Ukraine has reached the point with the battle in Bakhmut where they feel that they've used so many of their own soldiers, lost so much military equipment that they really don't have what they need to launch a counteroffensive. And if that's the case, I'm not advocating for this, but if you're a military, strategist in Ukraine and your goal is to, come up with some way for Ukraine to score military victories, well, if you don't have the equipment for a successful offensive, then securing defensive positions and carrying out asymmetrical type attacks inside of Russia may be the strategy. We have seen shelling of Russian towns kill 4 people in recent days. I covered on the last show, I believe, I covered it on the last show, that there have been, I actually haven't covered this yet, so I'll go ahead and talk about this now. Shelling kills civilians, explosion derails freight trains in Russia. So I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute on May 1st, and there's been some updates for it I'll go through over in the article. A Russian governor says explosions rocked his region over 2 consecutive days. On Sunday, the governor of the Bryansk Oblast posted on Telegram that 4 civilians had been killed by Ukrainian shelling, and the next day a train was derailed by an explosion. The governor of the region, which borders Ukraine, reported 4 civilians were killed during Sunday's attacks, and then said that rockets struck some structures, and that caused the casualties, while others were intercepted. And then on Monday, the governor posted on Twitter that his region again came under fire when a freight train derailed. He said, I believe 7 cars and 2 locomotives ended up being derailed, but overall, no one was injured. And then there was additionally an attack on Saturday, which we did cover on Sunday's show. That article was written by Connor Freeman, going over how a drone hit a oil storage facility in Crimea, and that caused a pretty large fire. And so I do wonder if this is the case, because my understanding is there's been 1 or 2 more attacks in Russia near the border with Ukraine that have led to train derailments on Tuesday into Wednesday. Now, I was looking and I couldn't tell if there had been 2 since the first or just 2 in total, but there's been at least 1 more train derailment caused by an explosion. Now, if Ukraine is shifting their strategy, it could be problematic for a lot of reasons. And the main one is that the White House in particular, but the U.S. and all of our politicians have put forward this narrative that Ukraine is preparing a counteroffensive. We send them all these Western weapons. They're ready to go, and that Ukraine can retake their territory and end this war. And if that is expected and Ukraine can't deliver, there may be some issues there. And I'm concerned that Ukraine may be pushed into carrying out a counteroffensive that even their military commanders and leaders and the American military commanders and leaders don't believe that Ukraine could do successfully, because there's so much pressure to carry it out. And here we have Representative Michael McCaul saying U.S. support for Ukraine depends on the counteroffensive. I think there's going to be a lot riding on the line with this counteroffensive, McCall told Bloomberg. If McCall is successful in the eyes of the American people and the world, I think it will be a game changer for continued support. If they are not, that will also have an impact in a negative way, though. The U.S. has put enormous weight on Kiev's expected counteroffensive and has helped the Ukrainians prepare for the assault by training soldiers and sending more arms. But leaked Pentagon documents and media reports indicate the U.S. doesn't expect Kiev to regain significant territory. McCall says that he expects Ukraine to focus on its counteroffensive on the land bridge Russia has secured to Crimea. And so if you look at a map here of what was Western Ukraine or Eastern Ukraine, you'll see the Donbass region and then the Sea of Azov, which, by the 2014 lines that were established, it is a sea where Ukraine has some significant coastline, and then Russia has the Black Sea, or not the Crimea, which largely borders it, and then you have Russia proper, which has a lot of border territory with the Sea of Azov, and then you have the Kerch Strait, and so that's what the Kerch Bridge runs over, and that filters into the Black Sea. And so previously, anything going from Russia into Crimea had to go over the Kerch Bridge. But now, with the territory that Russia has taken since the start of the war in the southern provinces of Ukraine, Russia can now transport goods around the Sea of Azov. And as I said, since the early days of this war, I expected that sea to essentially be turned into a Russian lake, that this will never go back to being an international body. And a part of that is Ukraine was planning to build some military bases with heavy support from NATO on that lake, which are on that sea, which was obviously going to be a huge problem for Russia. But also Ukraine having coastline on that sea creates some kind of international transit issue where, Ukrainian ships can go from the Black Sea into the Sea of Azov and then to the Ukrainian ports. And this caused a standoff under the Kerch Bridge a few years ago. And so I think this really circumvents that for Russia. Now they don't have to worry about the Ukrainians going into the Sea of Azov at all because they have no coastline along that body of water. So I'm not sure. My guess is that Russia is ready for a counteroffensive in that region and, is prepared. So the Ukrainian one won't be successful, but we'll see what happens here. I do say that the Americans and the Ukrainians are likely putting out a lot of misinformation right now. It's not entirely impossible that the U.S. is downplaying the chances it thinks that the counteroffensive is going to be successful as a way to deceive Russia into thinking that it doesn't have to be as concerned about the counteroffensive or something like that. Although I do kind of doubt that's the case. Here in that story, Kremlin says U.S. estimate on Russian losses plucked from thin air. This from Dave DeCamp, May 2nd, antiwar.com. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov says Tuesday that the U.S. estimate of Russian losses in Ukraine had no basis. His comments came after the White House estimated Russia had suffered 100,000 casualties over the last 5 months, including 20,000 killed. The White House offered no estimate on the Ukrainian losses. Peskov said that the U.S. has no way to obtain the correct data of Russian casualties. The White House claimed that about half of the casualties were fighters for the mercenary outfit Wagner Group, which has been doing much of the fighting in Bakhmut. Both Russia and Ukraine have kept a tight lid on their casualties in the war. Last fall, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, said both sides likely suffered over 100,000 casualties, but those numbers had not been confirmed. When Pentagon documents allegedly leaked by Jad Teixeira first gained public attention, slides surfaced with vastly different casualty estimates. One slide said 60 to 75,000 Russian soldiers, or 16 to 17,000 Russian soldiers had been killed, while as many as 71,000 Ukrainian troops were killed. U.S. officials claimed to the media that those slides were altered on Russian Telegram channels. The other slides showed that the Pentagon estimates between 35 and 43,000 Russians killed in action, and 15 to 17,000 Ukrainian troops were killed in action. Not sure where those numbers are. My guess is the Ukrainian numbers are much higher than the American estimates. So just a little update here on the battle for Bakhmut. The Russian Wagner Group had renewed calls for more ammunition for Bakhmut battle. And this has happened, I would say, 3 or 4 times in the past 5 to 6 months, where it seems like there is a real disconnect between the lead of the Wagner Group and the Kremlin, where he is putting out public calls for more ammunition. Now, maybe there's some level of Kremlin propaganda that I'm not understanding here, and that this is an orchestrated leak, but it does seem to me that this shows some issues within the Russian fighting forces here. Either logistically, they're not able to get the weapons to the Wagner Group. Maybe there's some kind of bureaucratic type issues between the two sides, where traditional military forces see the paramilitary Wagner Group as not deserving of the weapons, or they want to hoard them for themselves or something like that. I'm not sure. So one thing that Daniel Davis had mentioned, and some of the significance here, is that the Wagner Group has been doing a lot of the fighting in Bakhmut and other areas against Ukraine, and that means that most of the casualties are from the Wagner Group. And, the 300,000 plus troops that Russia has now, called up and trained and everything like that, are still a fighting force that has not been deployed in Ukraine yet. So even though it seems that The fight for Bakhmut is pretty much over, and that the Russian forces control most of the city. Ukraine vows it's not going to give up. Ukrainian military on Tuesday vowed to continue defending Bakhmut, as Russian officials claim Russian forces now control 90% of the eastern Donbass city. The commander of Ukraine's ground forces made the pledge while visiting troops on the front line of Bakhmut. We will continue despite all forecasts to advance to hold Bakhmut, destroying Wagner and most other combat-capable units of the Russian army. After his trip to the front line, he said in a statement, "Together with the commanders, we have made a number of necessary decisions aimed at ensuring the defense and inflicting maximum losses on the enemy." So I guess if you hear both sides here, they basically say the same thing, that the battle in Bakhmut has gone on for so long because the other side basically feels they're winning a war of attrition here. Ukraine is either inflicting more losses on the advancing Russian soldiers, or the the other side is that the Russians haven't taken more territory faster because Ukraine keeps sending forces in, and so they're racking up a huge number of casualties, and some people even say that the whole Ukrainian army, the meaningful part of the army with real combat experience, has essentially been lost in Bakhmut. Unclear which narrative is true. If either is true, there's probably a little gray area no matter which way it goes, but at the same time, very important here that Ukraine is committing to this fight still. All right, last story on the war in Ukraine here. I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute yesterday. Washington frustrated with allies' refusal to enforce sanctions on Russia. The White House is becoming frustrated with its partners in the Group of Seven for its refusal to commit to the economic war against the Kremlin. After the invasion of Ukraine last year, President Joe Biden pledged to isolate Moscow and cripple the Russian economy. However, the Kremlin has found ample access to the world economy, including some of Washington's closest allies. El País, a Spanish outlet, wrote on Monday that Russia has been able to find ways to circumvent the sanctions by imposing and exporting goods via third countries. The United States wants to plug these holes with a total ban on exports to Russia, but the EU believes this approach is not viable. Last month, Bloomberg News reported that Washington was seeking to have its allies in the G7 agree to ban all exports to Russia at the organization's summit in May. However, the Financial Times noted a week later that the proposal was unlikely to be supported by the European Union or Japan. One unnamed official told the Financial Times, "From our perspective, it's simply not doable." European Union officials speaking with Al Paez said the move is not considered to be sustainable. The Biden administration plan would change how sanctions against Moscow are enforced. The U.S. and its allies blacklist particular Russian products, companies, and individuals, barring Americans from doing business transactions with the targeted entities. If adopted, the export ban will prohibit all trade with Moscow unless there is an explicit exemption. The press for an embargo comes as Washington's plan to isolate Moscow has largely fizzled. When the White House initially imposed sanctions on Russia last year, it believed they would devastate the country's economy. However, leaked U.S. military documents shared online in March highlighted doubts about the sanctions spree among officials, with some assessing that Russia will be able to continue funding operations in Ukraine for at least another year. To weather the economic war, Moscow has found trading partners outside of the G7, including China and India. Additionally, the Kremlin has been able to circumvent sanctions and continue trading with Europe. Last month, Trade Data Monitor found that G7 countries, the US, Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the rest of the European Union, exported $66 billion to Russia during the past 14 months. The Kiev School of Economics alleges The $60 per barrel price cap on Russian oil has not been fully implemented, with some of Moscow's ports exporting oil at more than $70 per barrel. Still, Washington is continuing to press the G7 members to implement tighter controls on trade with Russia. Last week, the Treasury Deputy Secretary met with deputies of the G7 Enforcement Coordination Mechanism and pushed for stricter sanctions enforcement. However, some EU members are concerned Washington's strategy could open up debate and lead to sanctions potentially being weakened. So, this again is an update on something that we've already covered on the show, but I think it's incredibly important, because if the embargo is implemented, this could really upend the U.S.-Moscow relationship for decades to come, and with the rest of these Western countries. And it's also unclear if it's even going to be effective at all. All right, now on to Mr. John Bolton's big trip to Taipei. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton completed a week-long tour of Taiwan by meeting President Tsai Ing-wen. During the meeting, Tai claimed Taiwan was on the front lines in the fight for democracy, and as such, Taipei needs stronger ties with like-minded nations. According to the press release from her office, she said, as Taiwan continues to stand on the front lines of defense of democracy, she said that we are not only determined but also well prepared to protect our homeland. The statement continued, further stating that Taiwan is willing to deepen cooperation with the U.S. and all other like-minded partners to jointly safeguard peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, as well as the values of freedom and democracy. At the same time, the Taiwan Cybersecurity Resiliency Act, a new piece of bipartisan legislation introduced in the Congress, would back this plan. According to The Hill, the legislation would require the Pentagon to broaden and strengthen cybersecurity cooperation with Taiwan by conducting cyber training exercises, defending the country's military networks, infrastructure systems, and leveraging U.S. cybersecurity technologies to help defend Taiwan against Chinese cyber attacks. The Taiwanese president praised Bolton for his role in promoting Washington's military support for Taipei. Bolton, who has served in several positions in the George W. Bush and Donald Trump administrations, has long called for Washington to take a more aggressive stance against China and just about every country on the planet. In 2017, he published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal calling for arming Taiwan and sending troops to the island. He said he wanted to make Taiwan into an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Bolton has also called on Washington to revise or revoke the One China policy. Bolton praised President Joe Biden after the Wall Street Journal said about 200 American troops would be deployed to Taiwan. However, Bolton demanded the White House do more. I would home port a couple American naval vessels at Taiwan's biggest harbor, he said. So the One China policy is an agreement that governs the Washington-Beijing relationship and asserts that Taiwan and China are a part of the same country. During his trip to Taiwan, Bolton led a rally cry for the Taiwanese independence. He said, "Will Taiwan fight for its independence?" And a crowd of people responded, "Yes, we will." Bolton also called for Washington to recognize Taipei's independence, but now dual recognition made sense from a U.S. perspective, though it could be displeasing to Beijing. But that's the point. We must take to show that relations between the U.S. and Taiwan are fixed and will not go away. Bolton is the latest Republican presidential hopeful to make an overseas trip to a major weapons buyer. Mike Pompeo visited Kiev during the period he was exploring running for president. One of the expected GOP frontrunners, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, recently traveled to Israel. All right, just a couple more quick stories here on, what's happening with the U.S.-China relationship. Biden tells Marcos U.S. commitment to defend the Philippines is ironclad. It sounds a lot like the rhetoric around Israel, and so this isn't surprising coming from Biden and what he said and done so far as president. At the same time, it could, be a pretty large escalation, particularly when we're getting this kind of rhetoric from the military. So the head of the U.S. Pacific Fleet has said that the U.S. is ready to help the Philippines supply grounded naval ships in the South China Sea. And this is the Admiral Samuel Paparo, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, said China frequently interferes with the Philippines' attempt to resupply personnel who are stationed on the grounded ship. We stand ready to come to the Philippines' assistance in their exercise of their sovereign rights. And so this seems like it would be pretty provocative towards Beijing, and yet the U.S. appears ready to go ahead with it anyways. All right, everybody, with that, I'm going to wrap up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I'll be back with more shows later in the week. And again, if you could head on over to antiwar.com and make a donation. Right now, we have matching funds, and look, I know times are tight and prices for everything are going up, but even if you only got an extra $5, only an extra $10, head on over and make a donation. It'll become more money. Your money will be doubled, and I promise we will make good use of it. Thank you so much for tuning in.